This week, positive solutions for our nation's immigration system from both Republican and Democratic senators at our annual convening in downtown Washington, D.C.
I have a biblical worldview in the sense that I have a strong belief that every person is created in the image of God and has value and worth. There is significance in each individual. And so when you see people as, hopefully as God sees people, then it does change your perspective on how you actually deal with issues.
My mom and her parents were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust. Everybody else in the family was killed. They were able to rebuild their shattered lives in the only country they believed that they could do that. So they literally felt that the United States of America had saved their lives.
And a few days ago, over the Thanksgiving weekend, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol fired tear gas at migrants from Central America as they tried to cross the U.S.-Mexico border.
We come here to work. We want to work, not to create problems or crime. We like working, and that's why we are here, to see if we can get enough together to send to our families back home.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani with Only in America. Before we get to my fascinating conversation with Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma and Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado, my take on the week's events in immigration. So, as I've reported or I guess podcasted or, just talked breathlessly into this here microphone, over the last few weeks, thousands of Central Americans have taken matters into their own hands and have decided to flee the violence that was ravaging their communities. About a week or so ago, they made it to the U.S.-Mexico border and the San Ysidro port of entry at the Tijuana-San Diego line. What ensued over this Thanksgiving weekend was nothing short of just awful. The BBC's Will Grant reported on Monday morning from Tijuana on the U.S. southern border close to San Diego.
Police are now running, along with migrants, what was a peaceful march. Certainly it's taken a turn for the serious. People are now running through a very well-known canal that runs through Tijuana. It is just full of effluent. It is disgusting. And they are just forcing their way over. There's one sort of small footbridge that they're getting across, and from there they're running up the other side, and they think towards the United States.
The migrants on the march, though, were convinced this was the only course of action left open to them.
Donald Trump could give us an opportunity. We come here to work. We want to work, not to create problems or crime. We like working, and that's why we are here, to see if we can get enough together to send to our families back home.
They fire tear gas on us from over the other side. We're not doing this because we want to, but to try to find a better future. I'm sorry to anyone who we've caused disruption to, but if we didn't try something like this, we'll never cross the border. We have to try.
This after, as reported last week by the Military Times, the Trump administration issued an order to allow the military to, quote, engage in some law enforcement roles and use lethal force if necessary. Now look, we are the most powerful nation in the world, and really the best we can do is tear gas mothers and children. So take a minute to put yourself in the shoes of that Central American mother or father who picked up everything, grabbed their children, and walked hundreds, if not thousands of miles in search of safety. These are choices one makes out of severe duress. These are choices any one of us would make. What we have now on the U.S.-Mexico border is a completely unsustainable situation. Migrants will not be deterred from fleeing the violence in these countries. Mexico will do what they can to stabilize a dangerous situation. And one way or another, migrants from Central America will find their way to our border. Yet, as of now, America will double down on an enforcement-centric approach. A balanced strategy is sorely needed. I think we should invest in Northern Triangle countries, help Mexico manage the transit of migrants, and process asylum applications without trapping families in military detention centers or in Mexican shelters. To be clear, I'm not advocating open borders, but America has done much more difficult things. So we can live up to this challenge of welcoming migrants, of making sure that they can go through a process fairly and justly, and those who are allowed to stay, they can stay, and those who are not allowed to stay, they can't. But at the end of the day, we have to live up to the ideal of being both a nation of laws and a nation of grace. I'm Ali Noorani. Sign up for Only in America on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and at immigrationforum.org or any of your favorite podcast platforms.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
At our annual convening in Washington, D.C. on November 15th, we brought together about 200 voices from all sides of the immigration debate. They came with a common goal: to find a consensus on practical, workable, and humane solutions, something which the polls tell us is what the majority of American citizens really want. I was thrilled to moderate a panel discussion with senators from both sides of the aisle: Senator James Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma, and Senator Michael Bennet, a Democrat from Colorado.
So we're giving them an award at the end of this, but before we hand over the hardware, we've got some questions. And this is a conversation that will also be flipping into a podcast episode for Only in America. So let's just kind of jump into this. So, personally, not politically, what brings you to the issue of immigration? Why do you care about immigration reform?
So I have a little different background than many that are in Congress. I was 22 years in youth ministry before I came into Congress, which is not a typical route. I've yet to run into anyone that said, if you want to become a senator, be a youth pastor first. I've never met that person.
It's a youth vote, though, right?
I understand, yeah. But so for me, working with students, working with families, I have a biblical worldview in the sense that I have a strong belief that every person is created in the image of God and has value and worth. There is significance in each individual, and so when you see people hopefully as God sees people, then it does change your perspective on how you actually deal with issues. So for me, it's kind of a different route to be able to come to this issue.
Senator Bennet.
Thanks for having both of us. For me, it's personal. My mom and her parents were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust. Everybody else in the family was killed. And they managed to survive in and around Warsaw. After the war was over, they lived there for a couple of years, and then they went to Stockholm for a year. They went to Mexico City for a year, and then they finally came to New York City, where, excuse me, they were able to rebuild their shattered lives in the only country they believed that they could do that. I mean, they didn't. So they literally felt that the United States of America had saved their lives. And I have traveled my state, which has a lot of immigrants now, over and over again. I've been in every single corner of the state, and I have never met anybody who's got a stronger accent than my grandparents had. And I have never met people that are greater patriots than my grandparents were. So that's really why I've been involved in it.
So when these issues come up, and you and your colleagues are trying to find, okay, how do we move forward? Oftentimes it feels like there's a jump straight to the politics of the policy. Is there ever a moment where you kind of step back and say, hey, this is who my family is?
Yeah, it's usually about 13 to 14 seconds.
Yeah.
And then it ends up jumping straight to the politics of the moment. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the frustration here, because these are lives and people from all over the world. One of the border crossings on our southern border last year had 100 different countries represented coming through that one border crossing from Mexico into the United States. So there are literally people from all over the world that are coming to the United States, but we most often talk about the politics of it because the politics is so noisy. Quite frankly, all you have to do is raise immigration and our phones will light up. Either direction that you want to go. We'll have one group saying these are all about jackbooted thugs coming to take Latina grandmothers from their homes, and another group will saying everything's amnesty. And so it doesn't take long for it to devolve.
So how do we get past that division?
I think I've seen it. I mean, it was before James got to the Senate, and his work on immigration since he's been there has been really extraordinary. But I was part of the Gang of Eight that negotiated the 2013 immigration bill in the Senate. And when people say to me, it may surprise you to know this, but when people say to me, you guys suck, you deserve your 9% approval rating, nothing ever gets done in Washington, I always say that I've seen the standard of leadership that we need, and it was the leadership provided by the 4 Republicans that were part of the Gang of Eight, Jeff Flake, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and Marco Rubio, who sat there for 8 months knowing exactly what the base of their party would say about them being there, but doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do for the country and their party in that order. I mean, very much in that order. That's what we need in Congress, I think. We don't need biblical leadership. We don't need necessarily what you were teaching.
So it wouldn't hurt.
It would not hurt. I would
use
take
a little
it.
more biblical leadership.
I would take it. But I think if we had the standard that those 4 people supplied, the ability to be able to say, to go home, as Lindsey did, when he was up for election at the time, to go home to South Carolina and say, when he was being attacked by Tea Party people for what he was doing, say that, you know, we need to fix this problem, and I'm going to be part of fixing the problem. And we don't have to agree on everything. The founders of this country knew in a republic we would have disagreements. That was the whole point of not being in a place governed by a king or a tyrant who is telling you what to think all the time. So we treat disagreement today as if it's a surprising thing to have, and every single disagreement is somehow this fundamental principle. Neither of those things are true. It should not be surprising that we have disagreements, and not every disagreement is a matter of principle. We need to get the business of the American people done, and I think on immigration, by doing the work that you're all doing and the work James does and I do to try to build bridges among people of different political parties and walks of life to solve the nation's problem, I think ultimately we will succeed.
I was just saying that the politics really do scream and really do hold it back, and that is a big challenge. We were in a meeting back last February when it looked like we really were about to have a breakthrough, and a lot of the immigration conversation gets caught up in a lot of issues because there are so many issues in immigration, but there really is a lot of common ground. And if we can ever tailor it off and say, where's the common ground, where's the common ground, where's the common ground, we could actually move through several items and then say, okay, we got that done, let's move to the next item. But we have a hard time getting there because, again, of the politics of the moment. In one of these meetings last February with a bipartisan group, there were 15 or 16 of us or so in the meeting. One of my colleagues in the middle of the meeting leaned back when we were at this point talking about DACA and said, you know, I really haven't decided which way I want to go on this yet. I've got an angel on one shoulder that says these kids really need resolution, and I've got a devil on the other shoulder that says this is the greatest political tool that I have. And I haven't decided which one I'm going to use yet. To which I smiled at them and said, you know, as just a basic rule of life, when you've got an angel and a devil talking to you, go with the angel every time. I mean, this is not that hard. So.
That seems to be a good rule.
If I could just add to that, I think it's such a great point. I mean, we're at the point now where the ratio of getting stuff done to politics is as infelicitous as it's probably been in 100 years in America. And I think what we need to do is expect that there's going to be some politics maybe 10% of the time, but that we're doing our work 90% of the time. It's the reverse of where it is right now. Immigration is actually a perfect example. When I was starting to work on this before the Gang of Eight, created something called the Colorado, what was it called?
Colorado Compact.
Colorado Compact, thank you, gosh.
Which
I ripped off completely from a Republican Attorney General in Utah who had created the Utah Compact. We had a few more letters in our name, and it was actually not exactly the same. But the first people to endorse it were organizations that were the most conservative organizations in the state of Colorado, who represented farmers and ranchers, who knew that their livelihood and their family farms and family ranches were going to be lost, and their dairies, I know you, were going to be lost if we didn't figure out how to.
But you also did something interesting in that, because you were coming out of your election and you actually reached out to Ken Buck, who you just run against,
right? Yeah.
And you all said, okay, we're gonna have this conversation across the state.
And he was there on the. This is the Republican. He's now a member of Congress. Right. He was there on the day that we announced the Colorado Compact. Right. So what did that mean for me? It meant when we were doing the Gang of 8 bill and the Gang of 6 bill, I was able to stand on the floor and say truthfully that the partisan divisions that exist in Washington did not exist in Colorado.
So in Oklahoma, you talked about your faith, what brings you to the issue of immigration. How do you go back to Oklahoma and make the case for whether it's a fix for DACA or, you know, I mean, what's that conversation like with your constituents?
So it's mixed as it is everywhere else. Again, there's a lot that's fed to people, whether it's online or whatever they've heard at different spots that make it more tenacious and more edgy than it looks. When you talk to people on the ground that are not in the activist group, that are not being fed all the different things, and you have dialogue on it, most often people will say, this needs to be resolved. I don't know how it needs resolved. The common conversation is, there are people waiting in line. How do we honor those folks that are waiting and going through the process? I have a family member that's waited 10 years to be able to get in, or a family member waiting 15 years to be able to come through the legal process. Most everyone in Oklahoma knows someone who legally came to the United States as a legal immigrant. They also, most people in Oklahoma know someone who did not come legally to the United States. And so that mix is mixed up with both policy and people. One of my favorite conversations was about a year ago. A pastor, I was preaching in a church, and I finished up there on Sunday morning, and he and I were having this dialogue about immigration. And he said, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but in our church, we don't ask where people are from, if they're here legally or not legally. We reach out to everyone. And I said, as you should. And then he literally reached over and tapped me on the chest. He goes, but you're the government. And I know your heart for ministry. You've got to figure out how to be able to love people and still honor the law. And we're expecting you to do that. You've got to figure this out. But we're going to love everybody regardless. And so it is an interesting balance and dialogue.
And how does this also play out for you in the question of refugee resettlement? Because you've been very outspoken about the nation's responsibility to resettle refugees, and that's a really tough issue.
It is a tough issue, only in that it's become a tougher issue for us in the debate. This was not an issue for us years ago, and hasn't been for years and years and years. We as a country, we receive refugees. We do, and we always have. By the hundreds of thousands, we receive refugees. We have a very good process, about 18 months long, to be able to go through all the screening process, but we receive people from all over the world, and we have a very good system of integrating those individuals into our culture, and so they're able to join our culture. They have short-term assistance to be able to help them. There's a real focus on getting job training and to be able to get them integrated in the culture. It's a very effective system that can work. Now, I've had concerns like others where you have certain countries where we have no relationship with their government and we don't know. But in most countries, we do have some kind of connection in some way to be able to track documents. But that system works, and it has worked effectively for a long time, and there's no reason it should break down now.
So from both your perspectives, what do you think is possible over the next 2 years? And we've got DACA, you've got temporary protected status, you have the H programs. You know, everything is still on the table, right?
Yeah.
What do you think is possible?
First, or I'll take it first.
Go ahead.
So I walk in with a cautious optimism in every session. To try to walk in and say, okay, let's try again. There is a benefit to divided government if divided government decides to work. Some of the most difficult things that we've done have been done in divided government. What Bill Clinton did on welfare reform was a Democratic president, Republican Senate worked together, and it's been a long-standing successful program for a long time. there are ways to be able to do some of the hard things in divided government. We have that now starting in January. If everyone comes to the table and says, I'm not going to try to poke you in the eye to try to beat you in the next election, let's try to solve this issue, it is resolvable. Temporary protected status, I remind people at home all the time, those are not people illegally present here. Those are people legally present here. We have to resolve the temporary and temporary protected status at some point for individuals that have been here 20, 25 years. At some point, we have to stop calling it temporary. Right. So we have to fix the structure of that system to say, if we're going to call it temporary protected status, what does that really mean? But for those who have been here legally present for 20, 25 years, those folks should have access to be naturalized, to be a part of our culture and to be able to be here. They're legally present, they've followed all the rules the same way. I think that's an honest conversation that we can have with folks. The same thing with DACA. Those are individuals that most of the people that may even disagree about illegal immigration have a common agreement to say those individuals came here as children. We should have a reasonable conversation about what happens with that child now that is now an adult. But how do we actually resolve this in the future? The same thing as we have with protecting borders and all those things. Those used to not be partisan issues. It wasn't that long ago when the 650 miles of fencing was put up on our southern border. It was a wide bipartisan agreement, House and Senate and the White House. So there are some reasonable things that are out there. I just don't run into people that see this as a partisan issue when you talk about the humanity of it.
I would agree with that diagnosis, but I would also say that we've gone backwards. I mean, the bill that we wrote, the Gang of Eight bill, got 68 votes in the Senate. Never was taken up by the House, which was a shame, because I think that if it had been put on the floor of the House and the House had been able just to work its will, that bill would have passed, and we would have solved these problems, you know. Instead, now we find ourselves in a place where we can't even do the incredibly modest and universally agreed upon work with respect to the Dreamers. You know, I mean, the bill that we wrote in the Gang of Six to protect the Dreamers, which authorized $25 billion for the wall, was the bill that provoked the president to refer to African countries the way he referred to African countries. And we haven't really been able to reclaim ground since then. And that worries me. I mean, I think that I've become convinced that the president likes the issue of immigration and is not actually interested in solving these issues. That, you know, he is politicizing the wall, but not giving us a chance to actually solve it because he doesn't want the responsibility of building it. That immigration bill that we passed in 2013 had more than $40 billion of border security in it. It's not, you know, the president every day says the Democrats are for open borders. That's false. I voted for a bill that spends more than $15 billion over what he says the wall would cost. But it is a thoughtful approach to border security that includes 21st century technology, not 16th century technology, and would actually allow us to protect the United States of America. And by the way, all of that has to be done before the 11 million people that are here that are undocumented are able to gain their path to citizenship. So this idea that the Democrats are A, not for border security, and B, don't understand that the American people want to see a secure border before they extend citizenship to the 11 million people is not lost on anybody who voted for this bill. But every single day he goes out and says things that are untrue. And it puts my Republican colleagues in a very difficult position because like James or like my friend Cory Gardner is from Colorado who has supported a Clean Dream Act and supported the Gang of Six bill. He was part of that bill. He doesn't know day to day where Donald Trump's going to be on these issues, and that makes it very challenging. That is not an issue of Republicans and Democrats. I think Donald Trump has a sui generis view of immigration, and it's inconsistent with either party's approach to immigration for decades.
Let me throw one thing in there as well that is interesting in the dialogue. The president, though no grand shock to people, I don't like the way that he speaks, the way that he tweets, the way that he speaks. I just don't, and I've been public with that. He has moved a lot on immigration, a lot more than what I think a lot of people thought he would do 3 years ago. The president's proposal that he put out last February included citizenship for, what was it, 1.8 million people in the process. All of those that are not just in DACA, but everyone who was DACA eligible. It was a larger group than what President Obama had put forward. The challenge for him, and quite frankly for a lot of the folks in Oklahoma that I talked to, are for the adults. There is a real sense of compassion for the kids that are in the process, but when you move to the adults and say the adults that moved here and crossed a border illegally also get citizenship as a part of that, there's a lot of folks in my state that hold their hands up like, whoa, I have great compassion for kids, and they should get access to get citizenship, but adults that violated the law, I don't like that their end result of violating the law and crossing the border illegally also ends with citizenship. That's a dialogue we can and should have. But that's an area the president has moved and said, no, 1.8 million people would get citizenship in the process, and to be able to work through that. That to say, we had 4 different bills that came up in February. Right. If you take those 4 bills and pulled out the individuals, because they were all bipartisan in some ways, if you take those 4 bills, you had 80 senators that voted for some group to get citizenship. And you had 80 senators that voted for increased border security. Typically, that would cause the common ground to say, okay, those 4 bills all fail, let's take the common ground from each of them, and then let's try to actually press it to get it done. Instead, the week that we did that, the court jumped in and said, no, we want to look at this, and pulled it away from the White House in the conversation and said, we want to review whether what the president did with DACA is legal to do, and it's still in the courts. As soon as the courts pulled it away, it took the pressure off of the Senate, and it was very hard for us to get anybody back to the table and talk, because immediately after that, we're meeting every day, multiple times a day, trying to be able to work out an agreement. And suddenly when the courts pulled it out, I can't get anyone to be able to sit down and visit anymore, because it's like, okay, the deadline's gone.
But then this is the opportunity that comes with 2019, is that the court may very well put it back in the hands of Congress, as well as temporary protected status designations being lost for 300,000 to 500,000 people. Right. So what does Congress, what do you do with that opportunity? But then also, what do you need from a room like this, a community like this that is, pastors, police chiefs, business owners from across the country? What can we do on our end to help you take advantage of this opportunity that is coming?
The first one.
Yeah, I think the single most important thing you can do, and I think this is true on every issue, but immigration's particularly well suited to it, is to build as broad a coalition as possible. I mean, it's the diversity of the people in this room in terms of your interests and backgrounds is what we need to be able to cut through this. This will not be solved in a partisan way, and as James said earlier, the hope we should all have is that when you have divided government, you actually can get things done, because parties have to share the responsibility and the burden for actually achieving a result, rather than just blaming the other side for whatever it is they couldn't get done. So I think we do have an opportunity there, and I think we should try to seize it, because I do think there are many, many people in my state who are, who are business people, a lot of farmers and ranchers, as I mentioned, whose livelihood depends on our ability to resolve this issue and get this done. And that's also, and it's also true that there are a lot of people that are more traditional immigration advocates as well that want us to get it done. That's a good coalition of people that we can put together, I think, to achieve a result, which is what we need to do.
So a couple things you can do. One is continue to be able to raise to members of Congress and staff. And if you haven't met the staff for your members of Congress, that's the area you need to be able to meet. As a member, we'll work on 8, 10, 12 different issues in a day. That staff member that's assigned to be able to focus on that issue will be able to prioritize that issue and be able to track it day to day, every day with what's going on, because we count on them. While I'm working on this issue, they're still working on the previous one. Get to know that staff member in the office and ask a very simple, basic question. What's moving right now in immigration? What is the relationship? What is the dialogue? What negotiation is actually happening? Because one of the challenges that you have is, in D.C., senators run after the shiny object. Whatever the media is talking about right now, everybody goes and works on the shiny object of the week. And immigration is not the shiny object right now, but it needs to be done. Because there'll be a moment when the court steps back in and says, yes, one president can change the decision from a previous president. That's an executive order. I think it's going to be clear at the end. I can't imagine at the end of the day the Supreme Court's going to say the next president's bound by the executive actions of the previous president. If it's law, that's true. If it's an executive action, I can't imagine they're going to do that. If they do, that's going to set a horrible precedent long term, because every president will then try to do every executive action they can to bind a future president on it. So at the end, they're going to come back and say, no, this is back in the lap of Congress. At that moment, the press is going to run back and they're going to say, great, you've had a year to work on this, what's done? And there'll be lots of offices say, well, let's get the team back together and let's start talking again. It is our responsibility to keep working on this to get as close as we can to an agreement, so when that moment comes that Congress's attention turns back to it, we have a set of ideas where we have some bipartisan agreement to say, here's a framework, let's build on this.
So you talk about the conversation. Good.
I just would add something slightly different as well, which is that I think the greatest invention of America has been our commitment to pluralism. That's something that the rest of the world does not have, and it's something that we
is
have
not interested in.
And actually has many models of sectarian violence, religious hatred, which we don't have here in this, remotely in the same way. That is also under assault by the rhetoric that comes out of the White House and frankly on one of the major television networks at night. And I think that's something that all of us, that is a burden we have to bear, is to make sure that people in our communities feel welcomed here in the United States of America. And they will not feel that way if you don't say it to them. And if you don't find a way to put your arm around them and say, I'm glad you're here and thank you for your work. And I say that as somebody who before this job and after being in business was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, which was a school district that was 57% Latino. My families in that school district are absolutely terrified that they are going to be deported and that their families are going to be split up. Something no one has had to worry about since about the 1930s in the United States of America. So that I think is also something very important for all of you to think about, which is, have you been able to in your community, have you been able to reinforce the idea that we are a pluralistic nation, we are a nation of immigrants, we are committed to the rule of law. I believe we need to be committed to the rule of law. And these are our finest traditions. And that's something, if we don't say it, it's something that's going to be corroded in the political environment that we're in right now.
The way we've been putting it is that as a country, we can be a nation of laws and a nation of grace. It's not a mutually exclusive choice. So I've got one more question.
Those two things are really related to each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One question before we kind of hand over the hardware, if you will. So the name of the podcast is Only in America, and I've asked every guest the same question at the end. And that question is to finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
Religious liberty. In the way that we practice religious liberty and the ability for people to be able to have a faith of their choice and to be able to live that faith out, not just in private, but in public as well. That is a unique gift that we have to the rest of the world that, quite frankly, as much as we can multiply that, we should. Because it is the fascination of our culture that we can allow every faith, every background to be able to be here. And a lot of governments have no interest in that. Whoever the dictator is of the country, that is the faith or non-faith of the rest of the people, and it's imposed.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to what James said and go back to what I was saying earlier about pluralism. That's something that America is defined by, and religious liberty was a fundamental issue for the founders. They were doing the opposite of establishing a religion. The absolute opposite was, the idea was you should have freedom of religion. We take it for granted, but there are many places in the world where people have never had it. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of these things that they established 230 years ago, which generation after generation of Americans, have taken and democratized. The republic the founders created was not a very democratic republic. And it has taken other people, and I think of these other people as founders, just like the people that wrote the Constitution, who embraced the ideas in the Constitution, but said, you're not living up to the words of that document. And there are many examples of that, but some of the most recent are the work that was done in the civil rights movement in the 60s. And my view, for whatever it's worth, is that as citizens, we should think of our role as being founders, because the democracy, as Ben Franklin said, about a republic, he said, it's a republic, that's what we're creating if you can keep it. Because he knew it was the work that would be done by subsequent generations that would mean that the republic would endure or it wouldn't. And that is what is at stake right now, I think. And the question for all of us is, are we able and willing to achieve the level of citizenship that these prior generations of Americans lived up to? And if we do, we're going to be fine, and if we don't, we're going to have serious difficulty preserving the kind of stuff that James is talking about.
Can I say as well, real quick, thank you to the group that's here. You're on your own time to be able to set aside and to be able to do this. That's a gift to our community and to our culture. Keep the conversation going. Keep the dialogue going with individuals. Don't let this just get broken out into partisan rhetoric, and don't let people just oversimplify it. Thank you for trying to take complex things like immigration law, putting not only humanity into it, but mixing law and grace together.
Thank you. Well, we wanted to honor Senators Lankford and Bennet, not just for their years of work around the Gang of Eight, the Gang of Six, et cetera, but in this particular environment, it takes a special type of courage to lead. To be able to not just work with each other, agree to disagree, agree to agree, work with their colleagues across the Senate and even the House, but also to do the hard work and go back to your constituents and make the case of this is why as a country we value immigrants and immigration. So we wanted to appreciate your leadership. If I can pull this off here. This is for you, Senator Bennet.
Thank you very much.
And please join me in a round of applause for Senators Lankford and Bennet.
We're thankful to Senators Bennet and Lankford for being such great contributors together to our annual convening and for offering their own personal perspectives to the immigration debate. In the coming weeks, there will be more voices from our participants that day. Meanwhile, I want to welcome our new listeners to Only in America from Sri Lanka, Belgium, New Zealand, Bangladesh, Suriname, South Korea, and many other places around the world. You can subscribe to Only in America at immigrationforum.org. Our show is produced by the staff of the National Immigration Forum here in Washington, D.C. The executive producer is Kathleen Farrell, and the producers are Emily Chow and Regina Medina. I'm Ali Nurani. See you next week.